Hi, I'm Joel.
And I'm Ariel.
And we're looking at the real Jesus.
In our last program, we saw that Jesus was the real Messiah. And in order for that to happen, two major prophecies had to be fulfilled. The first was that Jesus had to have been born of a virgin, and number two, he would have to have been born in Bethlehem.
Which brings us to the next claim of the higher critics.
The idea that Jesus did not claim to be God is often put in a more simple way.
The word Messiah did not mean the Son of God. It simply meant the Anointed One.
Here's an interesting article by a really great friend of mine, J.P. Holding. That's entitled, Did Jesus Really Claim to Be God? J.P. is a guy who's actually here from Central Florida and is one of the foremost Christian apologists in the World Wide Web today.
There's so much to say in this article. I actually recommend reading it. It attacks the question from every angle. Here's a little clip of our producer Jay Rogers having an interview with J.P. Holding. Check it out.
Well, there are any number of places where Jesus does claim to share the divine identity of Yahweh, the God of the Old Testament. But I think perhaps the most clear are the places where he identifies himself with the one like a son of man in Daniel 7. Jesus repeatedly refers to himself as the Son of Man, and the imagery he uses corresponds with that in Daniel 7. The most pertinent example, I think, comes from the time when he was before Caiaphas in the trial before the Sanhedrin, and he said that you will see the Son of Man, meaning himself, seated at the right hand of the Father. Having himself seated like that at the right hand signified that he believed that he deserved the same honor and accord that God himself had. And that can only indicate that he believed himself to have the same identity as God or as Yahweh of the Old Testament. So Daniel 7:13 says specifically, I was watching in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man coming with the clouds of heaven. He came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him, and to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which shall not pass away, and his kingdom is the one which shall not be destroyed. Well, the figure in Daniel 7 is portrayed as one given a certain amount of equality to God. He is seated on a throne with the Ancient of Days, and to be seated in the presence of God for them meant that you had honor equal to that of God. So this figure was clearly intended to be understood as in some sense equal to God. There are places where Jesus identifies himself specifically with a figure known from Proverbs 8 and also from the Jewish intertestamental literature called wisdom. Wisdom was considered a hypostasis, or perhaps you could say an attribute of Yahweh, and therefore equal to Yahweh in terms of identity. There are several places in the Gospels where Jesus identifies himself with that figure, such as when he speaks of himself as using the finger of God to heal people. That's something wisdom would be expected to be doing. Perhaps the most clear example of Jesus equating himself with the divine wisdom of pre-New Testament Judaism is in which we have parallel passages in Matthew and Luke, in which Jesus says, in one version, therefore the wisdom of God said, I will send prophets, and in the other version he says, therefore I will send prophets. In both cases, he's speaking of himself in the role of wisdom, in the role of divine wisdom, whose job it was to send prophets. And in that case, he is clearly referring to himself in terms of divine wisdom. Before Abraham was I am would be a significant claim inasmuch as it would give himself pre-existence. The I am phrases are often connected with Exodus and the burning bush episode, in which it is said to Moses, tell them that I am has sent them. Now, since that was initially studied, connections have been made rather to I am statements made in Isaiah, in which statements are made by Yahweh, and Jesus more or less alludes to them when he makes his I am statements. Nevertheless, the effect is the same. When Jesus says I am, he is alluding to himself in terms of the divine identity.
The great Reformed scholar Benjamin Warfield wrote, it is quite clear at the outset that the writers of the New Testament and Christ himself understood the Old Testament to recognize and to teach that the Messiah was to be of a divine nature. For example, they without hesitation support their own assertions of the deity of Christ by appeals to Old Testament passages in which they find the deity of the Messiah afore proclaimed. As an example of this, let's look at Psalm 110, which happens to be the most quoted Old Testament passage by New Testament writers.
The Lord said to my Lord, "Sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool."
Jesus himself brought this prophecy into focus when he confronted the skeptics of his day.
While the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them, saying, "What do you think about the Christ? Whose son is he?" They said to him,
"The son of David."
He said to them, "How then does David in the Spirit call him Lord, saying, 'The Lord said to my Lord, Sit at my right hand till I make your enemies your footstool'? If David then calls him Lord, how is he his son?" And no one was able to answer him a word, nor from that day on did anyone dare question him any more.
Let's look again at Psalm 110 carefully. God addresses the Son as God. The Lord said to my Lord. He tells us that the Lord Jesus sits upon God's own throne. We have to ask, who except God could sit upon God's throne? Jesus sits on God's throne because he always was and always will remain God in every sense of the word.
There are a lot of passages that say that the Messiah is the Son of God and co-equal with God himself.
Psalm 110 is really clear, I think, and that's probably why it's the most quoted Old Testament passage in the New Testament scriptures.
So contrary to what we hear on TV, like for instance with Peter Jennings,
And many others. Yeah.
and what they do is they actually talk about the early Christians and how they have made up the fact that the Messiah is God himself.
Well, it's impossible that the early Christians made up these things, especially about the divinity, because it's something that we find throughout the Old Testament scriptures.